Welcome to another in our series of Kehillat Israel podcasts. This is a recording of Rabbi Amy Bernstein's weekly Friday morning Torah study.
We are on the triennial reading cycle, which means we read the middle. We are with the rest of the triennial world, reading the middle third of every portion, so that we can stay on the same portion with the rest of the Jewish world, but are not compelled to read annually the whole Torah, knowing we just don't, it's too much. But we want to stay with the rest of the world that is on the annual cycle on this portion, so we just read a third of it every year, and we're in the second third. And why, I don't have to do it that way, right? I can pick whatever I want to teach y'all. So, again, the reason I read on a triennial cycle and have been doing so for 18 years, is so that I am forced to engage with more material than I might otherwise choose to engage with. For instance, this morning's hunk of Torah, that is the triennial division, is one that I might choose to avoid if I had my druthers. But of course it's always fruitful when I have to figure out how to approach it this year in a way that feels meaningful to me, and I hope you find something in it as well. So we are beginning at chapter 7. We are going to begin at verse 8, just to orient us a little bit. We are after the commissioning of Moshe, which we read this year. So we are past the intro portion of the book of Exodus, which sets the stage for the commissioning of Moses, and his hooking up with his brother Aaron, who's going to be his partner in leading the people. Is there a bar mitzvah in the house? Yes, there is. It's good to see you. So a wonderful tradition some folks have who are regular Torah study attendees. They bring their bar or bat mitzvah on the Shabbat of their ceremony. They bring them to our Friday morning Torah study so that they see adults studying their parsha on their bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah weekend. So the second one of Lisa Simon over there to do that. So we've got the commissioning of Moses and his partnership with his brother Aaron to basically become the spokespeople for God before Pharaoh, right? This is not about Moses. This is about God. Moses is but the mouthpiece for God to deliver the message that God demands the release of the Hebrews from slavery. We'll recall that Moshe was raised in the palace. Yes? How long has he been away from the palace?
40 years.
40 years. We tend to skip over a big hunk of Moshe's development, which I think is something we should figure out a way to address. We have this image of Moshe as a baby in that whole story. Then all of a sudden he's grown up, which is kind of how it happens in the Torah too. He's grown up and then he's in the palace and then he has this moment where he loses his temper but takes time to look both ways to make sure nobody's looking. Kills the taskmaster, flees, right? And then encounters a bush. Right? It's not exactly right. So, but if we put ourselves in just the literary imagination of the tellers of this story, Moshe's from baby to killing that taskmaster is 40 years. He's 40 years in the palace. That's a long time. Right? That's a lot of your kind of coming into your identity, questioning who you are. Now we have adolescents. They didn't back then, but still I'm sure the same processes were going on. Like, who am I? How do I fit in the world? What is my relationship to power? What is my relationship to wealth, to resources, to control? So he's dealing with all of that, and all of that comes to him as a prince of Egypt. It's only when he commits something, an act that now makes him a fugitive. He doesn't ask for that change. I mean, he brings it on himself, but it's not something he thought through, right? He now is a fugitive. How long does he spend in Midian with Yitro, his father-in-law, because he marries Tzipporah? Yitro, the high priest of Midian, how long does he stay there?
40 years.
40 years. A whole nother life for Moshe. What is he doing in Midian? What does he do for his father-in-law?
Shepherd.
He's a shepherd. Reuben, why is it important that Moshe is a shepherd for 40 years?
Can you repeat the question?
Why is it important that Moshe is a shepherd for 40 years?
I only answer when I know the answer.
Got it. A good policy, Reuben. I should learn from you. So, anybody, why is it important that Moshe is a shepherd for 40 years? It's not an accident that he's in this business.
Well, he created a new life for himself with children and a family, and he's part of that culture. He's part of that world, and he doesn't want to.
It seems really important that Moshe have another adult developmental experience where he learns, as we see, yes and no, but he learns something about how to think things through differently as he lives with the high priest of Midian. His father-in-law is the high priest of Midian. So he's now in a culture of religion that seems very different from Egypt. And Egyptian religion and his position vis-a-vis Egyptian religion. Who was Pharaoh in the Egyptian religion?
God.
A god. Moshe is the son of a god. And now has, this whole other experience. Laura, you were going to say something about the shepherding business?
Well, it just seems kind of symbolic or metaphor for the next 40 years of shepherding these wayward, willful
shepherding
creatures.
the wayward, willful Hebrews. Right? Meaning
and he does it without horses and lassos.
Right, exactly right. So you cannot be in the ancient Near East and then everything that flows out of that culture. You can't be a leader without being a shepherd. You gotta be a shepherd. You have to. Who is all of this pointing to? Who are all of these texts of the Torah ultimately pointing to? Do we have any idea? When they went to write this? Who's it all pointing to?
The flock.
David. All of this points to David.
Okay.
It's commissioned by David, we think. So all the stories that are floating around, all these variant traditions of all these different parts of Israel, David is the first to unify the nation state of Israel. Right? Saul battles, right, to kind of beat Philistines but David is the final one to bring together all these variant tribes and have it be a nation state. They need a national history. So you got to take all the stories, the northern version and the southern version, right? You got to take the Civil War and the War of Northern Aggression, and you have the great unpleasantness between the states, and you have to put both of those versions in one national history to bring the North and the South together as one nation state. So David is the hero that all of these texts are pointing to. What does David do according to our stories?
He's a shepherd.
He's a shepherd. Of course he is.
And he writes poetry.
And he writes poetry.
And he's gorgeous.
And he's gorgeous.
He's a musician.
And he likes to show it off sometimes too, doesn't he? Dancing with only an ephod in front of the ark. So, and fool around, right, Reuben? Exactly. The excesses of the king. So, you have to be a shepherd. So Moses takes these 40 years to learn something else, to learn the next part of what it's going to take to be the leader of the Jewish people. So we tend to skip over all that. But that's really an important balance. Moshe knows about power. He knows about how to use it. He knows access to it. He knows the excesses of it. He knows its attachment to religion. And now he's learned how to take care of vulnerable, like lots of things going on at once. He's got to watch lots of different things in order to serve, in order to take care of vulnerable, willful creatures. And a different relationship to religion and a different relationship to power. How do we know he's exposed to a different relationship to power? Because of when Yitro comes back to visit him later and gives him some advice. We see what Yitro thinks about power, don't we? Yes, we do. So we know something about Yitro only from later. But if we retroject that back here, that's what Moses is marinating in. The wisdom of his father-in-law, who doesn't want to see a centralization of power, but thinks, right, it should be shared. Okay. That's where we have been with Moshe till chapter 7. He's been commissioned by God. He is the reluctant leader. He doesn't want to go. He doesn't want to do it. And he's going anyway. And he's going to go to Pharaoh. He's going to go back to the palace as a revolutionary. Right? He's going to challenge the authority of the palace, not on his own merit, not on his own sense of his power, but, right, of course, as a representation for the King of Kings, the king higher than Pharaoh, the power higher than Pharaoh. We cannot read any of this without reading this as a critique of Egypt, as a critique of its polytheistic system, as a kind of tongue-in-cheek poke at Egypt and its power, written by people who were often allies but often antagonized by Egypt, and retrojected very far back. This is not written when this would have been the system, right? It's written much later. And so we have to understand, who else is Egypt? Who are these authors when they're telling these stories years and years and years and years later? Who are they telling these stories about? Who are they writing these stories about? It's not Egypt anymore only. Okay? Egypt was one of the powers of the time. So let's start at 7:8.
Adonai said to Moses and Aaron, when Pharaoh speaks to you and says, produce your marvel, you shall say to Aaron, take your rod and cast it down before Pharaoh. It shall turn into a serpent. So Moses and Aaron came before Pharaoh and did just as Adonai had commanded. Aaron cast down his rod in the presence of Pharaoh and his courtiers, and it turned into a serpent. Then Pharaoh, for his part, summoned the sages and the sorcerers, and the Egyptian magician priests, in turn, did the same with their spells. Each cast down his rod, and they turned into serpents. But Aaron's rod swallowed their rods. Yet Pharaoh's heart stiffened, and he did not heed them, as Adonai had said. And Adonai said to Moses, Pharaoh is stubborn. He refuses to let the people go. Go to Pharaoh in the morning as he is coming out to the water, and station yourself before him at the edge of the Nile, taking with you the rod that turned into a snake. And say to him, Adonai, the God of the Hebrews, sent me to you to say, let my people go, that they may worship me in the wilderness. But you have paid no heed until now. Thus says Adonai, by this you shall know that I am Adonai. See, I shall strike the water in the Nile with the rod that is in my hand, and it will be turned into blood. And the fish in the Nile will die. The Nile will stink, so that the Egyptians will find it impossible to drink the water of the Nile.
All right. So, God says to Moshe and Aaron, when Pharaoh speaks to you and says, produce your marvel, you shall say to Aaron, take your rod and cast it down before Pharaoh. It shall turn into a serpent. So God tells Moshe and Aaron before they even open their mouths that Pharaoh's going to say, prove it. You claim to come on behalf of some invisible hoo-ha power. Prove it. All right? So God's going to make sure that proof is ready. So he gives Moshe the instruction that he's going to tell Aaron, take your rod, Aaron's rod, and cast it down before Pharaoh, and it's going to turn into a serpent. All right. This word here is not nachash. Nachash is snake. This is tanin. Tanin is a large reptile. Tell me some large reptiles you know.
Crocodile.
Ha 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 ha. Guess what the Nile is filled with? Mm-hmm. Which is why it's unlikely that Pharaoh's daughter was actually going down to the Nile to bathe. Right? Because there's crocs in the Nile. So, so possibly this is really talking about a much scarier, right, thing than a snake. But to this day, there's this tradition of the Egyptian snake charmers, right, practicing this kind of trick of taking what looks like a stick and they throw it down and it's a snake. So it continues to be a theme, a motif in Egypt to this day. So they can take a cobra and they do something so that it kind of goes into a catatonic state where it goes rigid. So it looks like a stick. And then boom, right, it's a snake. So it seems that Moses and Aaron need to speak and act in the motif of Egypt. God doesn't say, forget this nonsense with sticks and snakes and whatever. That's just magicians, charmers, those stupid Egyptians, right? We're gonna do it differently. God understands. Moshe and Aaron need to prove that they represent a contender, right, in this society. That they need to speak in the symbols, in the reality of the Egyptian court. So remember, when they come before Pharaoh, it's not like, they're meeting at a cafe for coffee. Right? We have to picture the scene, and many of us who grew up with Charlton Heston can. Right? That, it's a huge palace. It's a reception hall, and Pharaoh's court would have been present. His court physician, his court magicians, his advisors, right? All of the priests and priestesses of all of the gods of Egypt whoever's in political favor, right? That's who's present at these encounters. It's not private. And God understands, it seems the character God understands, we gotta work with the audience we got. So, here we go with the rod and staff turning into a tanin. Then Pharaoh, so this is what happens, right? They come before Pharaoh, they did exactly what God commands, and then Pharaoh, for his part, summons the wise men and the sorcerers and the Egyptian magicians in turn, and they did the same with their spells. Each cast down his rod, and they turned into serpents. So Pharaoh seems like, this is your God? I got this. Right? And calls his team in. And they, of course, can perform the exact same trick. Pharaoh seems fairly comfortable and, at ease with the whole situation, until what happens next? Aaron's rod swallows their rod. So the first indication for Pharaoh and his folk that, something might be going on, right, that we might have to deal with. But what happens? Vayichazek lev Paro, and the heart of Pharaoh was strengthened. V'lo shama alehem, and he did not listen to them. Ka'asher diber Adonai, as God had said. Thus is triggered the Esther Makot, the 10 catastrophes that will befall Egypt. This is the trigger. Pharaoh has now pulled the trigger. Something that, it is a very interesting term. There's lots, as you can imagine, written about it. What is this business? What does that mean? Vayichazek lev Paro. His heart was strengthened. Chazak, strong. That's literally the term. Okay? And he didn't listen, as God had said. This seems to be what triggers the 10 plagues. The intransigence, how do you say that word?
Intransigence.
Thank you. Of Pharaoh is what sets off these chastisements, right, by God of Pharaoh. And they are disasters that are going to strike Egypt over the course of Egypt's natural year. And there's lots of essays written on how each of these plagues occurs in a certain month, at a certain time, that's associated with a certain natural occurrence in Egypt that goes hooey wacky. And because of that, right, it becomes a plague. Right? So some of a good thing is good. Too much of a good thing can wreck your ecosystem. So this really is about the ecosystem of Egypt that God kind of pulls the wiring on, and it just goes and it goes crazy. No one is claiming that any of this is not natural phenomena that happen in Egypt. Not even the authors. Yes, it would be stupid to have a bunch of plagues that had nothing to do with the natural course of the year in Egypt, right? So people say, "Oh, it's happening. There's a Nile, and actually the Nile's filled with mud." And I can show you some of that, how that unfolds, like how they explain this, and it's like it's two completely different conversations, right? So this can be explained that the mud comes down from here and it makes the water look red, and that makes the frogs die, and so they jump out, the ones who are living, and that causes anthrax. So yes, no one's arguing that there is not a way these things could occur and could cause one another. No one argues that's not a possibility. That's not the point. The point is, each one happens when Moshe throws his staff down, or Aaron, or raises it over the water, right? It's not irrelevant to the natural phenomena of Egypt. It has to be part of the natural phenomena of Egypt, or it makes no sense. The point is, this is a power greater than Pharaoh and greater than the gods that are associated with those natural processes. Right? The Nile in Egypt is a god. So can it become so red with red clay that it looks like blood? Yes. That is a natural phenomenon. How our story is about how a force greater than Pharaoh and greater than the god that is the Nile caused that to happen. That means God wins, right? That's an important part of our story that I think we sometimes forget as we treat this as some silly thing over there every Passover that. So Pharaoh's intransigence sets off these consequences. And it's going to happen over and over. It's not like all 10 happen at once, right? He's given every opportunity after each one to have another one not happen. So this becomes the way that not only Pharaoh, but the Israelites and the Egyptians and everyone who will hear the story is educated about this Yod He Vav He. Right? It is not just a private affair. This is public warfare between Yod He Vav He and the gods of Egypt. So, we have this first occasion that triggers what happens next. So God says, who is Yod He Vav He, Elohei HaIvrim, the God of the crossers over, sent me to you, saying, let my people go, that they may worship me in the wilderness. Does that strike anybody as odd?
Who wants to worship in the wilderness?
So first of all, it's a little suspect. Who wants to worship in the wilderness? Is that what I hear you saying, Linda?
That's like a nice invitation.
So, let my people go that they may worship me in the wilderness. Like, what? Like, why? Okay. What else is odd about that statement?
Well, we always hear, let my
Because what do we say? What do we mean when we say, let my people go?
Let them be free.
Let them be free. Is that what Moshe is saying?
No.
Not exactly. Not exactly.
It's like you can have them on loan. It's almost like it's an intern camp. There's no time. Let them worship in the wilderness. I mean, they're just allowed to worship for a period of time.
Or that's the only thing they're free to do.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Let them be free so they can do something, not so they can just do whatever they want.
Ha 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 ha. Linda, you point to, for me, the reason we sing Mi Chamocha at every service. You are freed from Egypt, and it's in the Shema, the paragraphs following the Shema. Who am I? I am Yud He Vav He. And who is that? The one who freed you from Egypt. Right? In order, lihiyot lachem leElohim, to be for you a God. The God. I did not free you to be free. I freed you to be my people. What does that mean? How do we translate that? To build a society based on the values, the ethics, the teachings of this people. And its understanding of what is just and equitable and right and compassionate. Not to do whatever you want. Not to drive SUVs and poison rivers. I drive one too, it's okay. Right? It's not, I'm not freeing you because the value here is you being free. The value here is you being free in order to serve me. Robert?
Well, there's another problem from Pharaoh's point of view. These guys are his slaves, his workers, whatever. He's going to let a bunch of his slaves, workers, whatever, go free. What are the rest of the guys going to think? And oh, by the way, they're going to be free to go worship a God when he's the God. I mean, another God? You got a double problem.
Pharaoh has lots of problems here, right? Nothing that they're asking for is good for Pharaoh.
No.
Nothing.
Not at all.
Right? What, other people are going to ask for a little vacation? To go to the Sinai and hang out and, right? Have a fertility party to their God?
Another better God?
Another
God.
Right. And
better God.
Gucciame, like, am I not the guy, the big guy, the be all end all here? Hello? Lots of problems here for Pharaoh. So, you've paid no heed. So here's what Yud He Vav He says. By this shall you know that I am, and what does your translation say next? That I am what?
The Lord.
Interesting. Because the Hebrew is, by this shall you know that I am Yud He Vav He. Right? No terms here. There's no, it's not Adonai, Adoni. There's no Lordness here. By this shall you know that I am Yud He Vav He. Hine, behold. When there's Hine, right? My translation of that is yo. All right, like heads up, something's coming. Anochi makeh b'mater asher biyadi. I will strike with the rod that is in my hand the water of the Nile, and it will be turned into blood, and the fish in the Nile will die. Why is that important? Food source, food supply. This is the luxury of Egypt. Fish were the luxury of Egypt. They are known for it. It's a delicacy. So it's not like the wheat crop, that they make their bread from. This is going to hurt whom? Who eats delicacies? And the ruling class. This is hitting at the power sources in Egypt, their food supply, not the people. Right? This is going after caviar. Right? Literally. All right. So what's going to happen then? The Nile will stink so that the Egyptians will find it impossible to drink the water of the Nile. This hits the people. The fish hits the ruling class. The water hits everybody. What else is the water of the Nile? What else does it do?
Waters the crop.
It sure does. Egyptian agriculture does not depend on rainfall. It depends on irrigation. The overflow of the Nile, the flooding of the Nile, is what irrigates the crops. This is why, P.S., there's food in Egypt in our stories when there's a famine in Canaan. When there's a famine in Canaan, what happens? Everybody pushes down, not just our family in the story, everybody pushes down into northern Egypt. Because when there's no rain, you have no food. But in Egypt, it's not dependent on rain. As long as the Nile overflows, their crops are irrigated. So there's food there when there's not in Canaan. All right. So 19, someone want to read?
And Adonai said to Moses, say to Aaron, take your rod and hold out your arm over the waters of Egypt, its rivers, its canals, its ponds, all its bodies of water, that they may turn to blood. There shall be blood throughout the land of Egypt, even in the vessels of wood and stone. Moses and Aaron did just as Adonai commanded. He lifted up the rod and struck the water in the Nile in the sight of Pharaoh and his courtiers, and all the water in the Nile was turned into blood, and the fish in the Nile died. The Nile stank so that the Egyptians could not drink water from the Nile, and there was blood throughout the land of Egypt. But when the Egyptian magician priests did the same with their spells, Pharaoh's heart stiffened, and he did not heed them as Adonai had spoken. Pharaoh turned and went into his palace, paying no regard even to this. And all the Egyptians had to dig round about the Nile for drinking water, because they could not drink the water of the Nile.
Go on.
When 7 days had passed after Adonai struck the Nile, Adonai said to Moses, go to Pharaoh and say to him, thus says Adonai, let my people go that they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go, then I will plague your whole country with frogs. The Nile shall swarm with frogs, and they shall come up and enter your palace, your bedchamber and your bed, the houses of your courtiers and your people, and your ovens and your kneading bowls. The frogs shall come up on you and on your people and on all your courtiers.
All right. Notice there is a warning before every plague. If you look at a deep analysis of the plague narrative, it is incredibly intricate how it works. It is 3, 3, and 1. There's warning, 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 no warning, no warning, no. I mean, Moses, Aaron, Moses says, Aaron does, Moses says, Aaron does. There's an incredible architecture and symmetry to the plague narrative. I don't want to spend time on it, but know that it's not random. It's not just one thing after another 10 times. There is a very deep architecture and symmetry to the plague narrative. You might find it interesting, as do I, that in the ancient world there is a text that has been uncovered, a Sumerian text about the goddess Inanna, in which she tells of 3 plagues that she brought upon the world. In the first, she turned all the waters of the land into blood. As usual, this doesn't fall out of nowhere, these texts. It's taking the themes, the motifs of the region and using them, reconstructing them to send a new message. It doesn't come out of nowhere. Like we tend to look at this and go, oh, water turned to blood. What is that about, right? It's a motif of the region. This is a story told in Mesopotamia and in Egypt. So if Inanna did it, well, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh can do it too, right? That's important for us to remember whenever we want to judge these as, however we judge things in our ethnocentricity. We also see other places where water outside of the Nile becomes red like blood in someone's cup. So it seems to be about the water, not just about the Nile. But of course their water comes from the Nile, so it's related. Why is the first plague about the Nile? And why would this metaphor of blood in the Nile by Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh to get at Pharaoh, why is that particularly beautiful in its reconstruction?
counterpoint to the killing of the firstborn in the Nile.
Beautiful.
I read a little bit. But I just want to be...
You read below the line, didn't you? You have been reading commentary over there, Laura. Good for you. Right? So, to take a motif that's already in the region, right, makes sense. Inanna did it. It's happened in other, tales and whatever. Yud-Hey, Vav-Hey does it. What happens in the reconstructed version? What happens is, there's a story about taking little innocent Jewish life, okay, that's an anachronistic term, Hebrew life, and drowning, killing it in the Nile. What do we get as the first comeuppance to Pharaoh for not rectifying that situation by freeing them? That same source of life that he wanted to make a source of death becomes polluted with blood. You put the blood of Hebrew babies in the water, you won't rectify that? Watch what happens, says the God of justice. Watch. You wanted blood in the water? You put blood in the water? You got it.
An eye for an eye.
Here you go. So, poetic justice.
And it is Moses who was saved out of that water who does the justice job.
Of course. The agent of that justice was placed himself in the Nile.
To drown.
For Pharaoh, it would have been to drown. He's placed in the water because that edict had been given and his mother could no longer keep him because it would have been defying the royal edict. So she puts him in the Nile, which turns out to be the source of his deliverance. That is the person who will be the agent of Yud-Hey Vav-Hey's justice. It's a beautiful, beautiful, poetic, amazing, symbolic story that is really powerful about the things that are supposed to destroy us when we have help from people who love us and see forward and take risks and defy what everyone says is reality and has to be. We are saved.
So is this a derivation of the saying, there's blood in the water?
I don't think so. I think that's from sharks. Right? If there's blood in the water, you draw the predators who will then come finish the business.
Okay.
It's dinner. So blood in the water, I think, is about, indicating that there's going to be a feeding frenzy. I think. But, so for me, this is what we miss at Passover that I long for, is a return to appreciating, right, the many levels of the narrative of the Exodus from Egypt. Right? We skip over the Dam, Svardeya, Kini, don't lick your pinky, right? So, it just kind of, for me, like it loses, right, some of the beauty of the narrative of, so we went to that, that we can be saved from what everyone assumes must happen because Pharaoh said so. But then it doesn't stop there. If we're truly saved by these people who risk for us, who believe in us, who believe it can be different, and put us on the water, and we are somehow drawn out by someone out of compassion and love and protection that they give us, and we become this young, healthy, amazing person, right? It doesn't stop there for us. That is what gives us the potential to then challenge the forces that are and that everyone assumes it must be this way because Pharaoh said so, and it results in redemption. We are all Moshe. So for me, we somehow distance ourselves from this story as silly, as the retributive, angry God. And I think we miss the poignancy and the beauty of the message of the story. So we're not going to walk through the rest of the plagues. I want us to pay attention to what happens when Pharaoh's courtiers can affect the same business. What does Pharaoh do? Look at verse 23.
Pharaoh turned.
And what did he do?
And went into his palace, paying no regard even to this.
And what happened for the Egyptians?
And all the Egyptians had to dig round about the Nile for drinking water, because they could not drink the water of the Nile.
All right. So, and in a week, this goes on. Pharaoh turns his back and walks into the palace. Right? So we've gotten his heart is strengthened. He doesn't shema. He doesn't listen. He doesn't hear. He turns his back and he walks into the palace. Right? So this continues to be the response of Pharaoh. And what we get is he begs for relief, right? When the frog situation gets really disgusting and dangerous, right? Imagine all those rotting corpses and like, ugh, right? So, he asks Moshe and Aaron to intercede, to intervene. And then, he asks for relief. And so in some ways he begins to acknowledge at least that Moshe and Aaron have a connection to this Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh business that's starting to be evident, that he has to start to deal with them. He's got to start to negotiate with them, right? So, we see this happen, and then the courtiers try to do the same thing. When we get to the vermin and the lice, they try to replicate the same thing, and they can't. So the ante's upped. Now they can no longer keep up with Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh and pull the same tricks. So look at chapter 8, verse 15. The magicians begin to turn on Pharaoh and say, Etzba Elohim he. This is the finger of Elohim. They don't say Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. Elohim. This is the Etzba of Elohim. The finger of God. But what happens with Pharaoh? Yechazek lev pa'o. The heart of Pharaoh is strengthened.
When you say Elohim rather than Adonai or something,
Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh?
yeah, what does that mean?
Very interesting question. In source criticism, when we look at where the source of all of this comes from, the Elohist is one of the sources. There's the Yahwist and the Elohist, called in the source criticism literature J and E. J meaning Yahweh because the Christians mispronounced it. I won't go into why, even though it's tempting. I'm gonna curb my desire to go there. But the J in Latin, right, is Yah. So the Yahwist is J, the Elohist is E. Normally, it's understood to be northern and southern sources that then kind of get pulled together. So that's one way we look at it. Sometimes it seems Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh is used if an author is going to choose from both, chooses Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh when it's about mercy and compassion, and chooses Elohim when it's the God of justice.
But this is the Egyptian priests saying this.
But so the narrator is choosing to put in the Egyptian priest's mouth the name Elohim, possibly because it's a plural. What they know is a pantheon, right? So Elohim is technically in Hebrew plural. So we read it Elohim capital E, but possibly if it's Pharaoh's magicians, it's Elohim little e. They're gods. Their pantheon seems to be pretty powerful, right? So, Vayechazek lev pa'o. And what happens again? V'lo shama alehem. He didn't hear them. He didn't listen. He didn't heed them. Ka'asher diber Adonai, as Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh had spoken. Pharaoh refuses to hear Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh and heed the the message. This goes on and on and on, as we know, until the very end of the whole business, which is what? How's it all come to a final head?
The 11th plague.
So what would you suggest should be done at Pesach instead of the quick routine there? What would you...
Ay. Really, Sarah? Really, you want that?
Seder law.
From the point of view of the Egyptians, the closing of the waters after the Israelites.
Ah, nice. So you're calling the coming in of the waters and the smashing of Pharaoh's army the last plague. Very interesting, Reuben.
The 11th plague.
Well, I would have said it because you brought it up earlier. It's a bookend to the first one. It starts with the waters of the Nile and the story of Moses, and it ends with what sort of a reflection of killing of all the Jews. It's the firstborn, so it's a bookend to that.
Pharaoh who condemns baby boys to death has been given 9 opportunities, 9 catastrophes, disasters, to change a system that is that cruel and that tyrannical and that awful, and hasn't. And when we allow injustice and tyranny to continue, inevitably, says our story, inevitably says our wisdom tradition, inevitably it will come back to bite you the exact same way you've inflicted on the powerless and the oppressed. Exactly the same way. It has to be the death of the Egyptian firstborn. It has to be. How else can this story end? Because the message is what you do out there, the damage, the destruction, the suffering that you inflict, if you do not change your ways, America 2015, listen up. It will come back to destroy your own house. And if we miss that, we've missed the point, I think. We've missed the point of the story. We've missed the power of the message. And at Pesach, I'm concerned that we have lost the power of the message of we are supposed to identify with the oppressed. As we sit around our expensive catered meals, eating off our beautiful china, making beautiful pesadika sponge cakes, how moist and spongy can you get matzah? That was a competition in my family. Right? Mama Faye, of course, always had the best sponge cake. Let's be clear. Faye Bernstein won hands down every time. But it's a very long conversation that maybe we'll have around Pesach. Maybe I'll schedule a class for us to kind of talk through it, because it's become really hard for me myself to celebrate it, to really dig in. It's hard. And I'm afraid of what we're losing. I'm truly afraid of what we're losing. And I'll give you a handout that will get at an example of it. But maybe we'll talk around Pesach.
This is not in that direction.
Uh-huh.
But I'm just wondering, in light of what's going on in France, and I've been reading about the exodus from France and the call to Israel, and I'm just wondering if you have thoughts about that.
Say more.
I've been reading about the sort of question is, should the Jews of France leave and go to Israel? I don't know.
It's for them to know.
Right.
But I've just been reading horrifying accounts. I mean, I've known from the media that the past several years anti-Semitism has been rising in France, yada yada. But I'm starting to read specifics that I haven't known before, and it's horrifying.
And it's the, unfortunately, repeated experience of the Jewish people, right? This is not new. We liked to think, a lot of us who grew up in the shadow of the Shoah, a lot of us liked to believe that was the final battle. And it was decided and determined there. Never again. Right? And that we were going to make sure never again, but for sure Europe got it. For sure the world got it. Finally. Next week we're showing this film, The Jewish Cardinal, because I've been asked to respond, so I had to watch it. But anyway, like looking at that, looking like at church, folks who were setting up crosses at Auschwitz because it was their catastrophe. It was their people who suffered. And it's just kind of it's such alternate realities. It's like they had no clue about the Holocaust. None. Is it willful denial? Whatever. But we think it's over. We think it's done. We think it was decisive. It wasn't. I mean, I wish I had more to say, but it's not new. There's nothing unique here. Now everyone says, what's unique is that it's radical Islam. Really? Radical religion or fascists? Really? It doesn't seem to make a difference. Everyone's unified that you can kill the Jews. Right? It doesn't seem to make a difference whether it's driven by religion or something else. And it's anti-Semitism. It's been around forever. It's the disease that just doesn't seem to die. And what we can do is make sure that we are facilitating the Jews who want to leave getting out, and that we are making sure we are supportive of a strong Israel and a strong American-Israel alliance. It should never come up again in a conversation. What should they do? Halavai should only be in our time. B'mei Rabbi Amy. Look at Aviva Zornberg. And we have here a text from Ramban, not Rambam. We're used to seeing Rambam, right? Maimonides. This is Nachmanides. And Aviva Zornberg brings, who I think is one of the Gedolim of our time, one of the true genius teachers of our time.
Where are we?
Which page?
Yeah. Thank you.
She brings a text on your left hand page, and I'm so good at the copier that I have chopped off the page numbers. So I can't give you it.
Bottom left corner. Staple at the bottom left corner.
Thank you. The page with the staple at the bottom left corner. The text begins, here you have not listened. The text in the middle from Ramban, right? Here you have not listened. So this is what we were talking about. Lo shama, right? The Pharaoh didn't hear. He didn't heed. He didn't listen. Because God was about to inflict the first plague upon him. He told him that his wickedness was to blame, that he did not listen to the commandment of his creator. Now Pharaoh did not tell them explicitly that he would not listen or set them free, except for the first time when he said back in chapter 5, who is God? Who is this Yud-He Vav-He that I should listen to him to set Israel free? He did not reprove them, but listened to their words in silence. Going back to, I know it's confusing, but this text that we just looked at, that we just saw, that we just read, that's what Ramban is looking at. He listened to their words in silence, for he was afraid of the plagues from the time that they performed the wonder of the alligator that swallowed the Egyptian staffs. In the first plagues, he had his magicians attempt to duplicate their acts to prove that these were merely witchcraft. So in fact, he was afraid and reacted to fear by strengthening himself. That is the meaning of Vayichazek Lev Paro, that Pharaoh's heart was strengthened. All right, so what is the kernel here, like that she brings, or one that I find fascinating, is that it was out of fear that Pharaoh decides to toughen up. Right? When we get afraid, what is our first response?
Run.
For some of us, the first response is run. For others of us, what is the first response?
current stuff.
Fight.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I was thinking of...
Just thinking one of your kids. Yeah, right. So it's to prepare to fight. There's fight or flee, right? The first, or cooperate, new science is telling us. Fight, flee, or cooperate. So, cooperate, not there for Pharaoh. Flee, not possible for the ruler of the greatest empire of the world, right? Pharaoh, his response, he's a man used to having what he wants, used to having his way, having all the power at his fingertips. Pharaoh strengthens, right? Internally, takes a position of strengthening in order to, very interesting, a little different from stubbornness, which is what we tend to go to. I think it's interesting that Ramban lifts up the fact that actually a lot of the people we see being so, right, bullyish are often cowards.
No, fearful.
They're fearful.
It's a well-known psychoanalytic interpretation.
They are the ones who are most afraid. That is not how we tend to think of Pharaoh. I think it's a very interesting analysis of Pharaoh's character. So let's go to what Aviva Zorenberg says. The hypothesis that the wonders and the plagues are merely witchcraft provides Pharaoh with a source of courage and resilience. Witchcraft, after all, as a number of midrashim point out, is almost a cottage industry in Egypt. The peculiarity of these early episodes between Moses and Pharaoh is the speechlessness of Pharaoh's defiance. He listened to their words in silence. She's quoting Ramban. His resistance is passive. In the final analysis, such a listening is equivalent to not listening. In his silent obduracy, he expresses the meaning of, quote, not listening, non-listening. Ramban presents Pharaoh as refusing language. Fear freezes him in a catatonic silence. He does not express even resistance to God's word. The medium is the message, a deaf and dumbness, and acts a moral autism. The media is the message. The way he engages becomes reality, becomes what happens, and he walls off from even the suffering of his own people. The words of his own magicians going, we can't do this business that this Yadei guy is doing. Right? His officers who turn on him later. Pharaoh becomes, in the beautiful, amazing words of Aviva Zorenberg, morally autistic.
That's an amazing phrase. Is she the first one to use that? I mean,
I bet it's so her to come up with these genius things. It's like, what? I mean, we could spend another hour talking about moral autism, couldn't we?
She's saying he's in a trance, basically, that feeling like you're out of your body, you just can't function.
That kind of catatonic, inability to paralyze.
When you're so scared, you just sort of get this out-of-body experience.
Which becomes, the action is observed, or the inaction becomes interpreted by everyone else as just resisting, refusing.
Or you don't care.
Yeah.
Right?
He doesn't really know what to do. What could he do?
Because how could a pharaoh be powerless and catatonic in the face of another force? That would be impossible to think that he could be.
Right?
So he must be therefore uncaring and stiff-necked and
so I want to stay with these. I want to stay with these images. They're great, and I think it's where she goes. I love this. And Laura, you said something too about, I don't know, to David's point about kind of splitting off. There's simultaneously a kind of you disassociate. You get so afraid you disassociate, and yet in that kind of splitting off, kind of leaving your body that you talked about, in a way, then we become more densely, right? It's this weird thing. As we disassociate, we don't get lighter.
frozen.
We get, right, as we disassociate, as we kind of separate from our bodies and go to this alternate reality because we're so terrified or whatever, our bodies become, lahefech, the opposite. More dense, more rigid, more, right?
Set in stone.
And this is, of course, what she's bringing up is the imagery becomes the hardening of the heart.
But the people on the outside don't see what's going on in the inside. They perceive how they perceive.
This is the gorgeousness of looking at the character Pharaoh, I think, right? Is, of course, everyone else assumes he's so tough, he doesn't care about Moses, he's not intimidated, he doesn't care about the people either, he doesn't even, right? So that's everybody else's perception. They have no idea what's going on the inside. And isn't this what we always do?
Well, he's human. He knows he's human, and this power is greater than human. It's greater power, so that's why he's scared.
Right?
He knows he's God,
he knows he's up against the real thing.
Right.
Right?
More powerful.
And we always assume, I had a great teacher who said, we judge our insides by other people's outsides. So when I look at people, I assume, wow, they have it all together. And I am a mess. Because I know what's going on the inside. And what a struggle it is, right? To get the mascara on and get out the door in time. And everyone else seems to be able to do this life business so easily, right? But we always assume we know from looking at somebody on the outside what's going on the inside. And of course we don't have a clue what's going on the inside, which I think is this wonderful analysis by Zornberg.
Also,
And our scholars throughout history, by the way. Yeah.
God is, if I understand what you're saying correctly, God is saying to Pharaoh, the system that you are, the only out for Pharaoh would be to change and become completely ethical and change the entire system that the economy of Egypt relies upon. All of his money and power, everything that, all the goods that flow to him are based on a slave. It's like our immigration issues, should we say, or something. It's like it's easier to say, no, we're going to just keep on going.
We're going to close the gates and close the borders so we get to keep what we have.
Right.
America, the Western developed world, 2015. If we don't pay attention to the story, truly, I'm a holy roller this way, and I own it. If we don't pay attention to the message of this story, we are doomed. I'll just say it that simply. Yes. You cannot continue to support your lifestyle on the backs of the third world. And at some point, there's a tipping point. And it's going to be us in the chariots. It's that simple. All right. So, Lisa, it looked like you were pointing to a piece of text that you'd like us to read. Would you read that, please?
What do you want me to start? The grammatical comment right there?
Yeah.
In a grammatical comment, Rashi gives us a lightning sketch of a pharaoh who absorbs the black energy of Nathan into himself, so that he has become its very embodiment, dense, impenetrable, speechless, and he betrays no flicker of response. He is impacted in silence. God has foretold that it would be so, that Pharaoh would not listen to you. In this reading, this means more than he will not do as you wish. It indicates a growing willed incapacity to hear and to speak.
Okay, good. Take that next paragraph, please. In a brilliant reading.
In a brilliant reading,
Ha'emek davar.
Thank you. In fact, suggests that God here sketches the whole progress of the plagues. The day will come when Pharaoh will literally refuse to listen to you. Before the plague of the firstborn. On that day, Pharaoh says, "Do not see my face," and dismisses Moses in anger. That overt anger and verbal rejection will represent a crack in Pharaoh's impermeable silence. The hardening process receives its fatal setback in this final moment of explosive fury, which leaves him suddenly vulnerable to pain.
Pharaoh as refuser?
Non-porous, inaccessible, blocked by fear, and subject of the
Orach Chaim's
description too.
Read his description.
Okay.
Pharaoh's heart
has become heavy. He is not sufficiently affected even to respond negatively to the plague. So God has to explain to Moses the meaning of his silence. He has closed up his heart. He refuses to set the people free.
It's so incredible. So these words she uses, dense, impenetrable, speechless, and that grows, right? So much so that it becomes adjectival, she says. So somebody who always acts in a way, right, of peace, of wholeness, of serenity, right? What do we call them? Peaceful people. Right? In other words, how we behave at some point becomes adjectival of us. It becomes who we are. Right? So, because we skipped Rashi's actual, it's okay. So in the grammatical comment of Rashi, what is Rashi's grammatical comment? If you refuse to set them free, if you are a refuser, this form of the verb, ma'ain, is adjectival, where a person is described by his acts. Like shaket, quiet, shalev, peaceful. It's a form of the verb that isn't that you're doing it, you're being quiet. You're described as shaket, a quiet person. Right?
You are it.
You are it. There's a point at which your behavior defines you. And that's the form of the verb. So Rashi looks at the grammar as a drash. That it's deeper than, why is it, we just skip over the grammar. Okay, he's becoming a refuser. No! Rashi says, stop, look at that. He's not just acting and saying no. He has become a refuser. That's different, says Rashi. Pay attention to that. And so she unpacks it, Zorenberg unpacks it, and looks at Ha'emek HaDavar for another, and the Orach Chaim, all exploring the same kind of thing, that Pharaoh starts to become a person of hardened, he starts to become a person with a heart of stone. He begins to solidify, right? And then there's nothing. There's no response. He's a refuser. He's shut down. He's impenetrable, non-porous, inaccessible, blocked by fear. This is the true hardening. It starts with him yechazeking his leg. It starts with him strengthening his leg, taking that posture, and it results in a process that then it ossifies Pharaoh.
Well, I would say also, it doesn't start here. It starts with, he's Pharaoh. He's not like some shepherd who's all of a sudden becoming an Egyptian person of no power who hasn't been oppressing anybody for his entire life. Whether he was born to that position or not, that's what he's been doing. He's been having the slaves do this. He's not like the nice guy on the corner who happily is
resilient. He's never in his life had to be resilient, right? He's never had to negotiate. He gets everything he wants. Like, I'm thinking, like a person like this, how do they suddenly come to the idea that they have to negotiate? It's not on his radar screen. It's like,
and he's got bad acts on his hand. I mean, he already it's that, and also, it's not like, oh, poor Pharaoh. No. He's in chorus because he's afraid. He's just afraid. We have to understand him. You know, it's Pharaoh. He's been he's the slave owner who was born into it. Right. And yeah, sure, some people refuse to participate, but
the deeper analysis that Zorenberg goes to, I think, though, is, and sometimes those folks, when they get afraid, are the most terrifying.
Yeah.
Right. The folks who already have blood on their hands, the folks who already aren't exactly great people, right? Then when they really get confronted with something that truly existentially terrifies them, we have death camps and Zyklon B gas.
Right. The reaction is in proportion to...
And especially when they have access to power.
Yes.
And to controlling the situation, right? And so we just so forget sometimes the... Anyway, I don't want to beat it.
This is also a very psychodynamic interpretation because you can think of a person or a family or a community,
of course,
or a society that's enclosed, ossified, impermeable circle.
And what happens to those people's hearts and ability to feel and be open to the possibility of pain, right? It's tragic. Of course. Of course. And have been
challenged and get super
shut down.
The way he did, and that's when they're really
And in order to make a hole in the circle, it needs something in from the inside of the circle or something on the outside of the circle to... Because the circles get so close.
All right. I want to do one more piece of business here before you do a little piece of another thing. Because I want to go back. So the next topic that we're not going to cover from Zorenberg, if you look down, it says Pharaoh, the unbearable lightness of being. Right? So she's going to go on. I didn't bring it to you, but you can, of course, buy the book and read it on your own. You should. She's going to go on to talk about that the possibility of kalut, of lightness, is what terrifies Pharaoh. That he looks light before this Yud-He-Vav-He business all of a sudden, right? He's never had to negotiate. He's never had to confront mortality. He's going to live forever as a god when he's buried in that huge pyramid that stands as a, pointer to his now being risen as a god in the afterworld, right? So he becomes through all of this more and more terrified by the possibility of being light. And so what does he do? He becomes more and more dense, more and more impermeable. And what is a Hebrew word that describes that? Stone. Yes. We go to the Hebrew root. Kaf, vet, daled. Kaved. Heavy. He becomes more and more kaved.
To hold on to what he's got.
In response to the possibility of the opposite. Right? That he's truly a lightweight. So he becomes more and more heavy. A stone heart is heavy. So, kaved, in doing that, what does he claim more and more to be? He claims more and more to be a being of kavod, of honor, of glory. Who do we use this term of? God. He digs more and more into this aspect of being godly. He's so dense and so heavy that he becomes stuck. He becomes stuck. And I know that looks like, oh, what a modern term. It's not. He's stuck. This word is the same word used this way when his chariot wheels are in the mud. They get kaved. They get stuck. So I love the play that she goes to on the dual aspect of heavy. It is both what we say of God, that God has weight. God matters in the world. We use the word kavod of God. God's kavod, God's glory, God's magnificently intensified presence in the world. Yes, and the other side of that is heavy in a way that means stuck. And which is it? So
is he becoming more fearful?
100%.
No, I mean, is he now, we use heavy, is it also more dangerous as you get to that point? There's some point at the end when you just lash out and kill. That's the message.
I think so. I think it's definitely part of it. That's the danger. That's what happens. He is going to lash out, isn't he? And he's going to lash out, and his chariot wheels are going to be the undoing of him. They get stuck. And the waters crash on top of him, and he is, of course, destroyed.
So the guy who killed Rabin was
lovely. Yeah. Wow.
Orthodox and stuck.
Wow.
And could not be flexible enough to consider some kind of peaceful way out.
And so tied up in knowing that he was on the side of God. Of kabod. Of God. So on the side of God that he had the right to do what he did. And that becomes, of course, stuck and brings complete destruction to the possibility of peace. That's what happens. This is true for all time. Let's go to, I just want to share this one thing with you. I think it's so great to pull it into our times. Go to the part that starts Vaera. The link to this will be on the podcast. But I want to drop down to the paragraph that says, we can understand this in contemporary terms, right? So this is also dealing with Nachmanides' reading of the hardening of Pharaoh. Somebody read it, we can understand this in contemporary terms.
We can understand this in contemporary terms when we recall moments of feeling as if we have no choice in a particular circumstance. There are times when we lock ourselves into certain situations and patterns of relationships, feeling that we really have no other choice. Is this ever really true? In a sense, we abdicate our ability to make a choice because we fear it may cause suffering or a level of discomfort we do not wish to experience. And sometimes our inaction is simply the nature of habitual response that blinds us to new possibilities and prevents us from truly exercising our own free will.
Lest we want to say this is just about the pharaohs or the crazies or the, right? Let us not forget the message to every single one of us who say, I have no choice. I had no choice but to, really? Really? Is that really ever true? I had no choice?
I was only following orders.
Or I was following orders, or, right, I had no other option but to, really? Or is the real translation, because any other option would have meant, what? Loss of face. Change. Sharing my control.
The thing is that the Israelites were going to leave anyway. So he had a choice. It's like he could have made the choice to let the people go. And in history, he would have been a hero.
We could decide, since it's going to happen anyway.
You don't. And probably the thing you're worried about is going to happen to you anyway.
So, funny you should say that, Linda, because the next piece I gave you from My Jewish Learning by Evan Wilkenstein from American Jewish World Service talks about stuff that's probably going to happen anyway. But we don't pay attention to what might we do differently so that it doesn't have to go down so badly. I think, is that part of what you're saying, Linda? Is that they were going to leave anyway. Pharaoh had some choice about how that went down. It can go down, this can be, I say to my daughter, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. But you're getting in the car seat. Do you remember when they would go rigid like a plank? Like this? Like that's going to stop me from getting you in the car seat. Right? You're taking the antibiotic. This can go easy or this can go hard. And that is completely up to you. You have complete control here. You are completely in control of how this goes. You have this choice or that choice. That's exactly right.
Going back to the conversation that you were saying about should Jews be leaving France or staying. I know I have a friend who's nearly 90. He was a Holocaust survivor, lived in Poland, middle class to upper class family. And she was telling me the conversations that her parents were having around the dinner table in Lvov, in Lodz, in the 1930s, about this is what's happening in Germany, and we're hearing bad things, and what should we be doing? And this lady put it this way: her uncle was a pessimist, so he took his family and went to Palestine. Her father was an optimist, stayed in Lodz. And but for her, everyone died.
Paula, you have got to turn that message, my friend, around for us, because you cannot leave us with the optimists all get wiped out. I'm sorry.
Yeah. I lay that to you.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you. This is why I get paid the big bucks, right? Because it's going to get laid at my feet. So I would suggest we be optimistic realists and take seriously the warning signs around us. And rather than gushry and get crazy, can we get motivated? Can we get active? Can we start doing something so that it doesn't have to go down? Why do we have to wait until there's absolute environmental devastation before we act? Why? Because we're Pharaoh. Because it's human nature. Until it's in my house, until it's my firstborn that dies, I am too afraid to change, to let go, to give up some of my power, some of my control, some of my privilege, some of my comfort, some of my wealth, whatever, fill in the blank, until it's in my home and touches me and my family. Then and only then, when it's destruction in my own backyard, do I go, oh, it's inevitable. Right? And did it have to be? Right. So we define how it's going to go down, right, on some level, which I think is a really important piece by American Jewish World Service about the ways that we don't want to look, about the ways that we don't want to hear, we don't want to deal with so many things in this world that just pick up a newspaper. We don't want to know, and I get it. And my question for us this Shabbat is: so what is it we need to do, right, to become optimistic realists who are ready to face at least some degree of willingness, responsibility for change, and for giving up some of our, we get so kaved that we get stuck. How do we move more into this sense of kavod, of weightiness that means it's weighty enough that I need to respond. And I need to stay flexible and open and hopeful enough to be willing to move into that change.
Which issue are you referring to now? Are you
You cannot trap me, David. You cannot trap me.
Are you talking about France? Are you talking about the environment?
Pick one. Pick one.
A long list.
Pick one. Sudan, Ebola, pick one.
I was on a conference call yesterday with a woman from France, which is a large call, actually, about 300 people on the call. And the Charlie Hebdo, this issue of, is there a moment when finally France wakes up? Mm-hmm. Because they can ignore the Jews forever. Mm-hmm. You know, another violent, another terrorist act. There is apparently a plan in France to have a proposal in 8 days to decide how France is going to react. And her point at the end was, if they choose to react, it's hopeful. If not, pick up your ticket to Tel Aviv.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
And that was as stark as you could get.
Who's they in this situation?
The Jews in France. Pick up your ticket to Tel Aviv. If France does not pick up the action, do the what they need to do to wake up.
You're talking about the government?
The government. Right.
Well, and it's, so it's on the individual level. I don't want to pick up a newspaper and read about what's happening to folks who don't have clean water to drink and their babies dying. I don't want to know about that, right? So that we turn away on an individual level to so many of the issues in our world because it touches our own whatever.
Vulnerability?
It means I have responsibility then for the ways I participate in allowing that to happen. And as a world community, we do it, right? When we say, the big discussion is Iran right now. I just watched this great show, the Warwicker trilogy, and, the British Prime Minister character has been funneling money, off of a lot of stuff into a secret account for when he's no longer Prime Minister, and he's kind of villainized. You think he's the villain and our guy's gonna bring him down, and then at the end he delivers this amazing speech, this amazing monologue about because y'all are too lazy to act. And you can condemn me siphoning off money, but I've put it in an account because I take seriously, I'm a patriot, and I take seriously the threat of Iran that you all refuse to deal with, right? And I'm the only one with the vision and the courage, and I'm realistic enough to know somebody's going to have to do it, and it's going to cost billions. And it was just kind of like this, wait, what? Maybe he's not the villain anymore. And because... And I'm not saying I'm taking a position one way or the other. I'm saying I think there are issues that the world community better wake up and deal with before it's too late.
What program is this?
It's called the Warwicker trilogy.
PBS.
And it was on it was on PBS. Did you see it?
No, I recorded it.
Go watch the third. It was really interesting because it challenged my own assumption about he's so corrupt and blah, 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 blah. And then I thought, yeah, and he's ready to do what... Are we ready to really take it seriously before it's too late? And I don't know the answers. I don't know any of the answers. I'm not pretending to. My job is to raise questions. Thank God. I have the best job. I'm just here to say. Right? My job is to lift up. Are we ready to ask some hard questions? And what are our responsibilities vis-a-vis addressing, writ small as well as writ large? And my friend... It will fall on your shoulders. The generation behind us, it falls on your shoulders.
You have a lot of friends, though.
To fix what we haven't done so well. Halavai, you be strengthened, a long, healthy, and happy life to do exactly that. Shabbat Shalom.
You've been listening to Rabbi Amy Bernstein's Friday morning Torah study from Kehillat Israel in Pacific Palisades, California. For more information, go to our website, www.ourki.org.